Good evening to everybody. Namaskara from BPAC. We wanted to continue our session series with experts to understand current issues and current topics from them directly. Today's topic is on concepts and principles in delimitation. The reason why we chose this topic is because that we are at a critical juncture right now where we will be looking at a delimitation process to be completed by 2026 for central level and state level elections have to be done, and there are certain critical aspects that is involved in this has not been done. So for that reason, we wanted to understand the principles, because whether it is at BBMP level, state level, or at a national level, the principles remain the same. So we'd like to invite Lalit Panda from Vidhi Legal to join us today to share his research with us. I'll just take a minute to introduce Lalit Panda. He's a senior resident fellow at Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. He's worked as a legal policy researcher since 2016, writing publicly and assisting a range of government bodies on legislative matters. He has researched in areas as diverse as data protection, higher education, state governors, and elections as well. He's also worked as a consultant to the 21st Law Commission before joining Vidhi Legal. So thank you, Lalit, for your time, and we are happy to invite you to share your research with us. Before that, just a couple of housekeeping. The attendees today, you can write to us on your question and answer window. I will take up the questions after the 45-minute mark once Lalit has gone through his presentation. So without any other thing, so let's take it forward. And thank you, Lalit. Please take us through your session.
Thank you so much, Harshita, and thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. It's a real honor to be speaking for the BPAC for all the amazing work it's been doing. I just wanted to give a little background before I get into the subject of what I want to discuss. We have been. I'm part of the constitutional law team of this of my organization, Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, so the research that we have done on this subject, delimitation, has been from the perspective of constitutional principles. And specifically, it was instigated by this problem that was coming up in the Lok Sabha, which was that delimitation, the allocation of seats to different states, and then the further drawing of boundaries on the basis of it. The allocation of those seats had been frozen since 1971, and the opportunity to relook at this allocation is coming up soon in the next decade or so. 2026 was one deadline to get started on the process, and the allocation itself is supposed to happen according to the census in 2031. So this I'm just mentioning because it was the instigating event that resulted in us deciding to work on this topic. But I understand that many of you may be interested in the subject of delimitation from a perspective which isn't to do with national politics or to do with Lok Sabha, but to do with Bangalore specifically. So Bangalore and the way in which municipal politics happens in Bangalore. So, but you can be assured that what I will try to explain to you today are the basic principles of how one should think about delimitation. What are the various concepts, values, and principles that are used across the board in all kinds of delimitation processes in various levels of politics. So because I will be talking about these basic principles, you will find that these are easily applicable even to questions that you will be applying in the context of Bangalore. But I will be using as a backdrop just to give you an understanding, and because it is what we actually did study, I will be giving you as a backdrop to my explanation this problem regarding the Lok Sabha. So I will be only using that as the background example to help you understand what we have studied, and I hope it will be useful to you as well. So without further delay, I will share my presentation and take you through it to guide you through this subject. I understand that questions will not be immediately asked, but if you have a question even in the middle, of what I
Yeah.
am saying, please put it down. If there
Yeah,
is
so they will drop in the questions as you are in the process of taking us through your presentation. And then
yes.
towards the end, I will either you can read it or I will read it out
Okay,
for you.
but if there is something that doesn't make sense, please feel
Mhm.
free also to put in a question to interrupt me as well. And Harshita, if you see that question,
Yes,
you can stop me. I will make sure that that gets explained right then, because otherwise it might get too delayed.
understood.
Okay, so I will get started on this. I'll just share my screen for the presentation.
Right.
Is this visible?
Yes, this is. You can, I think, go into full screen.
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so as I was mentioning, this idea of delimitation, it actually helps us understand something which is very basic to democracy. That when we're trying to understand what democracy is and how we have designed our democratic institutions, delimitation is one of the underlying principles about trying to understand how it works. So many of us think about delimitation, of democracy in a very simple terms, which is that democracy is supposed to translate the will of the people. There's supposed to be purity of elections. Whatever people think, that is supposed to decide how government is run. But once you start stepping into the details about how this process of deciding what is the will of the people, you start realizing that actually there is no one thing called the will of the people, and it's not something that is floating out there in space, that it's some tangible cloud or some kind of a object out there that you can hold. There are, in fact, many ways in which to think about what the will of the people is. Different kinds of democratic institutions, different kinds of rules, different kinds of ways in which to design democracy actually result in very different meanings of this idea of will of the people. So one can just understand this by, I mean, though I'm sure many of you, since you are engaged in political activity in a very direct sense, you understand this very immediately and intuitively. Voting itself is not all that democracy is. There is a lot to democracy that goes outside of voting as well, that supports it, that makes sure it is a appropriate method in which to run government, where the government is accountable to the people. But even if it isn't all of democracy, it is still a central mechanism through which democracy is made meaningful. So it's important to understand how we design these voting mechanisms specifically. I try to use this. I'm sure this is something that you may, grasp without my having to explain it. But I like to use this example that when, for example, two teams come to play cricket, they are, trying to win the game of cricket, and they are, playing against each other. They're competing against each other, just like how political parties are competing each other with each other. These cricket teams are also competing with each other, but all of the questions about how you compete with each other, that is, where is the boundary, what is the distance between the two wickets, what is the distance of the pitch, the fact that you have to hit the ball with a bat and not with some other device, the fact that you have to run between the wickets and you can't just run halfway and then come back and score one run. All of these rules that decide how you win the game of cricket actually designs the game of cricket itself. So we can't talk about winning and losing without understanding what that the rules of the game are to start with. Similarly, in politics, people don't just fight in the streets. They don't just decide who wins, elections by fighting with each other, and whoever manages to be the strongest wins. There are rules that decide what are the institutions by which voting takes place. So I want you to just grasp this analogy, this kind of metaphor, that if politics is like a game, then all of these rules regarding democratic institutions are like the rules of that game that decide how you play and compete with each other, and how you win, what you win, and how long that victory lasts for before you have to play another game. So, just this background to give you a metaphor. The next thing that you need to grasp to get this idea of delimitation is, what are we delimiting? We are delimiting constituencies. And this concept of a constituency is not as simple as we think of it very often, which is that it is territorial. I'll try and explain different examples about how constituencies are to be understood to give you a sense of how important this idea of constituency is. So, in very simple terms, when we say democracy is about we, the people, deciding how government is going to be run, what is this we? Who is this we that is being represented? Somebody could easily say that everybody in the legislature, all the MLAs or MPs, they are representing everybody in that state or in that nation. You are a representative of all Indians if you are in the if you are in parliament. But if we understand democracy to be about how people hold their representatives accountable, then you have to understand that because each member of parliament is representing one constituency, is holding a seat for one constituency, they are in a very direct sense representing that constituency. And how you decide what that constituency is? Does that constituency have one particular shape or different or a different shape? Which geographical location does it cover? Does it cover a different geographical location? Those people will be different. Who is this we who is represented in a legislature is decided by the shapes and the drawing of these boundaries, and decided by who gets how many seats in this very geographical sense. This is because in India, our constituencies are territorial, both in in parliament and in legislative assemblies. That is that the people who hold seats in the legislatures, they are representing specific territories, and the people within those territories are those who directly hold that member accountable. But you don't have to think just to understand that constituency is more than just territory. It can be more than just territory. You can just think about the way in which, in many, say, professional bodies or in many other forms of settings, elections aren't done in a territorial seat basis. It can be done through a very different categorization. You can have, for example, only lawyers in Delhi as being the constituency for deciding the Bar Council of Delhi's representation. So only lawyers in Delhi, that is a constituency. This is another understanding of constituency. So you can also imagine hypothetically that in India, instead of having territorial constituencies, you could have constituencies that were based on professions. That there will be in parliament 12 seats that are meant for people who are representing lawyers. Lawyers are voting for those. There are 10 seats for doctors. There are 20 seats for farmers. Something like this could have happened. But that is a choice, a conscious choice not to do it that way, but to instead do it territorially. I'm explaining this to you to just help you understand that we have very fixed ways of thinking about representation, constituencies, but actually the way in which it can be designed is a conscious choice that we have to think about that why question. Why have we chosen to represent people by territory? Another way of representing people is called proportional representation. In a system of proportional representation, the votes that are cast actually decides which constituency you fall in. So, for example, in proportional representation, one political party will get as many seats in the legislature as the proportion of votes that were cast for that political party. So if political party A gets 30% of the votes and political party B gets 70% of the votes, then the vote share determines the number of seats that you are getting, the proportion of seats that you're getting. In this system, your constituency isn't territorial. So everybody who voted for party A is the constituency of party A, and everybody who voted for party B is the constituency of party B. Again, just to explain how constituency is a very flexible concept. So this is just simply to get you familiar with this idea of constituency, that what is the function of this idea of constituency. This idea of constituency is like a bridge between trying to understand how people will be represented, who will be represented by who, and how will they be represented. So you have to think of this constituency idea as a bridge or a medium by which we make democratic representation possible. There are many ways to make it possible. This is one of the ways we have chosen to make it possible. Now, I will try to explain that problem that I said was the immediate focus of our study, which is what is going to happen in the Lok Sabha in the coming decade. Now, the Constitution of India says that there are two rules that decide how Lok Sabha seats are allocated. The first, in Article 81, it says that as far as practicable, every state will get a certain proportion of the seats in Lok Sabha. How is that decided? You have to make sure that the ratio between the seats that are given to that state and the population of that state is the same for each state. So if one state has, let's say, 20 people and they get one seat, then if another state has 40 people in that state, very just hypothetical example, if another state has 40 people, then they should get two seats in the legislature. So the ratio between seats and population have to be the same. Then you also have to make sure that inside the state, the the constituencies inside the state are drawn in such a way that you draw those boundaries of the constituencies in such a way that the population of each constituency is the same. So if in one state you draw boundaries, divide that state up into parts, and you make 10 constituencies, you have to make those 10 constituencies, draw those constituencies in such a way that the population of each of those 10 constituencies is the same. So if there happen to be 100 people in a state and you divide it into 10 constituencies, each of those constituencies should have only 10 people. What is this? And then there are further rules, of course, that it's not just decided on the basis of population size and individuals. There is an understanding in our constitution in Articles 330 and 330 and 332 that it isn't just individuals who are being represented. There are also problems that happen when groups, certain social groups, are not adequately represented in the legislature. So there has been reservations, political reservations in the legislature for scheduled caste persons and scheduled tribes persons under Article 330 and 332. So I want you to remember this idea that reservations is also added in to this idea of constituency drawing, because we will get back to it in a little while. Now, what is the crisis that is taking place, impending crisis that is coming up for the Lok Sabha? Because population changes over time, population of different parts of the country, even within one part of the country, the spread of population within that part, it might change from time to time. That's why delimitation is supposed to be the way in which these constituencies are drawn and the way in which the seats are allocated to the different states. That is supposed to be redefined every 10 years when the census happens. Any change in the population is supposed to be reflected again. So this is another basic idea that ensures that any such system of defining constituencies remains dynamic. Now, what happened is that after the 1971 census, during the in 1976, in the 42nd Amendment, the allocation of seats to different states in India was frozen on the understanding that some seats, some states, particularly that's what was mentioned at the time in South India, because population planning was executed much better. The national government felt that it would be punishing these states that managed to control their population better if they were having to lose seats after the delimitation process. So because they felt that this would be punishing them, they froze the allocation of seats to different states for since 1971. Now, what has been the consequence of this freeze? I'm just explaining this to give you an understanding about why this subject deserves study and why similar problems can happen in any other level of politics as well. So because of this freeze on delimitation, specifically the freeze on allocation of seats to different states, what happened is that the population change that took place resulted in the population of states, mostly in North India, but also some in West India, the population of those states rising considerably faster, and the population of southern Indian and some eastern Indian states rising much more slowly. The rate of change was less. What this means is that if today we try to comply with the rules that are in Article 81, which is that the ratio between the seats that are given to one state and the population of that state should be the same for every state. If we try to do that today, what will happen is that a number of southern and eastern Indian states, mostly it will be for the southern Indian states, Tamil Nadu, undivided Andhra, Kerala, but also for West Bengal and Odisha, altogether, if we reshuffle the seats altogether, they will lose 31 seats. So if there are certain number of seats that are currently allocated, that have currently been allocated to these states, they will reduce by 31. And Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh will gain 31 seats. What does this mean? What this means is that if we strictly follow this question of population proportionality, that we have to put seats allocated according to population size, then whatever was the balance of power between different states and different regions in India at 1951 and 1971, that will change drastically. The way in which politics happens in India, the way in which different communities from different regions are represented, to what extent they are represented, how much power they have in the union level, that will change drastically because of this shift. Any law that the government tries to pass in parliament, they will be able to pass with the support of representatives more easily, with just the support of representatives from North India, and with less reliance on representatives from, let's say, South and East India. This is broadly what's happening. So what we are seeing happening here is that there is a specific concept called political equality, that is equality between people in politics. This concept of political equality seems like it is colliding, it is coming into conflict with the idea of balance of power between different regions of India, which is part of a federal arrangement. That these different states that exist in India right now, they should get some level of say and power in deciding what's happening in governance in India. So this was the this was the reason why we wanted to study this subject. But what I'm going to explain to you after this is an attempt to figure out how to think about this problem. A very simple way to think about this problem is to look at Article 81, see that it is saying that you need to give this population size similarity, the ratio, you need to look at this. And after you have looked at it, what you do by ensuring that these seats are allocated according to population size is that you ensure that any one person, an individual who is voting in Lok Sabha elections, that person's vote has the same value as the vote of any other person. This is captured in the slogan, one person, one vote. And we can add on to that one value. So, to give this in context, if let's say in one constituency, the population size is 200, and that constituency is giving you one representative in the legislature, and there is another constituency where the population size is 100, and that constituency is also giving you one representative in the legislature, then any person who is voting in that constituency with more population, with 200 people, that person's vote is worth half the value as the vote of another person in that constituency which has only 100 people. Because with just 100 votes, or just like 50, 60 votes in that first constituency, you can get that same one representative in the legislature. But you need not 50, 60, but 110 votes in the more populous constituency. The constituency that are 200 people, you need more votes. So your vote is counting for less than it does if you were in a less populous constituency. This idea, this idea that your vote should not be worth less than the vote of any other person, that it should result, it should have as much control, as much impact, as much influence as anybody else who is voting in that election. This idea is what people sometimes call as political equality when they use the phrase one person, one vote. So you can keep this principle in mind, because it is a foundational principle that many people intuitively think is the definition of voting rights and political equality and democracy itself. That you have one vote, I have one vote. It's not as if you have a master's degree, you get two votes. And because I only have up till matriculation, I get only one vote. We get the same number of votes, and the effect of that vote should also be the same. That is the attempt that people are trying to make when they say that constituency sizes and these ratio between seat and population has to be equal between states. That is the idea behind this. So if somebody is in a constituency that is more populous, that there are more people, then what happens to their vote is, I'm just going to use that technical term, but you understand this concept already because I explained it. What happens in that situation is that the power of your vote is diluted, it is reduced in quantity. So this is quantitative dilution. But this has to be understood in contrast to something else, which is called qualitative dilution, which is the nature of interests that you have, not just the fact that you have a vote, but what you want to achieve through that vote. So people often talk about qualitative dilution in the context of a group. Now, I will try and explain this with an example. So imagine that there are two constituencies, and let's say I'll try to use an example here. Let's say it is, sorry, one second. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to use an example that might be more palatable, I mean, more immediately recognizable to you. Let's say that we are trying to define two constituencies, KR Puram in Bangalore and Mahadevapura. I'm not sure that these are actual constituencies, but let's just say that these are two constituencies. KR Puram is in the north and Mahadevapura is in the south. So let's say that in elections, it has been seen that KR Puram often gives often elects a person from party A. KR Puram is consistently having a majority of people voting for party A. And Mahadevapura is consistently voting for having a majority of people voting for people from a representative from party B. Now, let's say you have information after doing a survey of this area, you get information that in Mahadevapura, most of the people who are voting for party B, the majority of that proportion of people who are voting for party B, they are all at the northern side of Mahadevapura, just bordering KR Puram. You can divide that area in a way that, let's say there were 60 people who were voting out of 100 people in Mahadevapura, 60 people were voting for party B. You can divide that region. You know that they are all in northern Mahadevapura. You can divide that region in a way that 60 people are split into 30 and 30. Some of those 30 are added into KR Puram, and the rest of the 30 are left in Mahadevapura. Now, what happens is that that majority that existed inside Mahadevapura has been broken in half. It's like divide and rule. You break that majority into half. Now, it is one part is in one constituency, another part is in another constituency. Now, this majority has been made into a minority by putting them into two different constituencies where voters of party A are now each in majority in KR Puram and in Mahadevapura. So this is a very, very real possibility of what you can do while making delimitation, while doing delimitation at any level of politics. You can divide any geographical region where there is a majority of voters of some particular interest, some particular group, some particular political leaning. You can divide them into parts and make them into minorities. So if you realize what I'm saying, the way in which you draw the constituency boundaries is actually deciding your election results. While previously party A was winning in one constituency and party B was winning in another constituency, if you draw the lines differently, party A can win in both constituencies by mixing those people from party B, the voters of party B, in such a way, dividing them in such a way that they are no more a majority in the second constituency. What is this concept called? It's called gerrymandering. But you can just think of it as a biased way of drawing constituencies. If you try to draw constituencies in such a way that you are deciding the results of the elections, then you are doing what is called gerrymandering. But this is a problem which is slightly different from the Lok Sabha problem. The Lok Sabha problem isn't about how you divide these different groups, but it is about whether or not giving seats to people according to population will result in certain kinds of communities not getting as much power in democratic governance at the national level. So while in gerrymandering, you actually have choices. You can divide constituencies in many different ways. In some ways, you make that majority into a minority. In other ways, you ensure that that majority continues to have representation. So there are many alternatives. In this way, actually, the individual idea that voters need to each have same value of voting power is not conflicting with the group representation idea that different groups need to get representation. It's not conflicting because while there might be ways in which you can draw it to ensure that everybody gets each individual gets same voting power, but certain groups don't get represented. There are other ways of drawing in which you can achieve both of these things. You can ensure that every person's vote has the same value, and you can also at the same time simultaneously draw it in such a way that ensures that you have representation for this group as well. So this is different from the Lok Sabha question because here there are no alternatives. If we want to ensure that everybody in India, their votes while having the general elections, if you want to ensure that each of their individual votes have the same value, then necessarily this will result in reduced influence and power for certain states in India. There is a direct conflict and we can't avoid it. So I just wanted you to try and separate these two different kinds of problems, drawing the constituency versus allocating seats to different states. I am hoping this comes through. If there is any issue, please feel free to ask me about this. I'll try and explain it again. So, why is it that we care about political equality to start with? These are very intuitive things, so I'm not going to try and explain it in detail. But essentially speaking, the idea comes from the understanding that because you are a human being, you have equal intrinsic worth. The worth of you as an individual is the same as anybody else's. That's one idea. The other idea is that if you do not allow each person to have similar levels of control and give more control to some people, you are actually saying that that person is having a better competence at governing, at running the state or the government than the other people. And we don't know whether somebody is necessarily always and for all purposes better than other people to govern any particular political unit. We don't have this certainty that one person is necessarily better because people make mistakes. If you give them power forever, it also corrupts them, and we know this from experience. And lastly, we also have this historic experience that if you do not give a particular community representation, then they necessarily, and you don't give them voting powers, their interests are necessarily always given less weight. We have seen this with women before women were given the vote. We saw this with racial minorities in the US, with caste minorities in India. If you do not give people representation, this results in their interests and preferences not being counted as much, and often not at all. So you need to understand these basic explanations as to why we try to have equal power for everyone in democracy. The idea of democracy itself is that you shouldn't have more power in deciding who is going to govern the nation than I do. That's where it's coming from. But as soon as you start thinking about this concept a little more, it starts becoming more complicated. Why should we decide the idea of political equality only on the basis of voting? Because even if you give people exactly the same number of votes, that doesn't mean that their interests are getting represented in the same way, that that their interests are being considered on par with anybody else's interest. That whatever I want from the government will not be getting equal consideration, equal weight as somebody else's interests from what they want from the government. It could be that if you actually gave everybody's interests equal thought, consideration, and weight, the result of the laws that you will create will be different from what would happen if you just gave them one vote. So let's just try and separate these concepts a little bit. Everybody can have equal voting power, but that doesn't mean that the chances of your win of your group or people who have the same interest as you, people who have the same preferences as you, that doesn't mean that you have equal chances of electoral success. So the chances that your group will be represented may not be the same. It also doesn't mean that there will be equal chances of legislative success. Even if you have equal representation, that doesn't mean that legislations will be caring about your interests as much as others. Now, if you just think about what it is, what we are caring about when we think about political equality, you'll realize that the idea of political equality isn't just about having one vote. It is the idea that in governance, our interests are cared about, are weighed on par with others. That you are not treated as inferior, that your interests are not treated as inferior just because, let's say, there are fewer people like you. So this is a concept that is in tension with the idea of equal voting power. Let's try and unpack this a little bit. If, let's say, we really care about this concept of one person, one vote, that everybody should get one vote and the value of that vote should be the same, then one of the things that one person could suggest is that is it really, I'm going to skip the first point about whether it is important. I'll just go directly to the second one. Is it really neutral? If we think that this is really all that democracy is about, then the reason we think this is that we think it is impartial, we think it is fair, we think it is neutral. Because if, let's say, I don't want a particular kind of policy result, let's say I don't want um, so much budgetary allocation for street lighting. I don't think that deserves so much budgetary allocation. I think something else like let's say health resources. I think that should get more budgetary allocation. If I personally think this, then if the government decides to put less money on health and more money on lighting, on street lighting, then the fact that I got only one vote and somebody else also only got one vote allows me to feel that that result, that the government choosing to do this, they arrived at it impartially, neutrally. Everybody got one vote exactly. And so that is why when majority has said that street lighting is what we really care about, then that result is something that I can accept. That at least it wasn't because somebody else had more power, more influence. It's because everybody had the same amount of influence that now I can say, yes, it was arrived at fairly. But as soon as we think about whether this concept is really impartial, we realize that this depends on what we were discussing earlier, which is that do we know whether in these territories the distribution of these preferences has happened in an impartial way. If it so happens that in all the wards in Bangalore, the people who cared about health as a something that required more budgetary allocation, they were all part of those constituencies in ways that they were never a majority of any one of those constituencies. But if you added them all together across the whole of Bangalore, they will be actually a majority of the entire city. Then what has happened? What has happened is that the geographical distribution of these preferences has decided the election result, not, in fact, an equal consideration of what you want from your government. You have not been treated the same as everybody else. What has actually decided government and representation is where you lived and how many people like you lived in that constituency. So I just want you to have that image in your mind that if you distribute people across these different territories in different ways, you can have different results in the election and different things getting represented and getting importance. So what this means is that while of course we have elections because we don't know what people want. And that's why we ask people to come to the polling booth and tell the election system what they want, that I want to vote for this party. Until the time that that person has come and told that polling booth that I want to vote for this person, this is what I want, we don't know what they want. And this is fundamental to democracy, that it's because we don't know what people want that we ask them to come and tell us in the first place. If hypothetically, completely imaginarily, we knew what everybody inside Bangalore wanted, somehow we did a survey and we found out this is what people want, then in that case, we wouldn't even ask for people to come vote. We'd say, don't have elections. We have done a survey with you. We know what you want. So we will just elect you. We will just decide governance on that basis. If your views change, we will change the rules. We will change the policies. But we don't do it that way. And the reason we don't do it that way is because we don't know what people want. Now, I want you to keep this on one side. We don't know what people want. We don't know whether one person knows how governance should happen better than another person. That's why we ask people to come vote and we give everybody one vote each. And that value of that vote is the same. But at the same time, we know that if we do it only this way, we know this, that some groups will get underrepresented. That is, after all, why the Constitution allows for reservations of some groups in parliamentary elections, because of the knowledge that there will be predictable injustice if we continue with voting by just giving one person one vote and stopping there. Because we know that if that happens, then some groups will never get political power. We decided to modify this system of one person, one vote, of how that system results in certain representatives by instead reserving certain seats for those individuals who we predict, we know now a little bit that they will be underrepresented. So, what is happening is that there is a tension between not knowing how people vote, what people want, and so therefore asking them to vote, and between knowing that if we ask people to vote and give them only one vote each, there will be some kinds of injustice that takes place. So I want you to just think of this concept as something that is relevant for any problem in delimitation, including the Lok Sabha problem. We know that we want to give everybody one person, one vote, because that results in them being recognized as having equal status, as having equal worth in the political process. But voting itself is not all that matters. What also matters is whether people are treated equally, whether their preferences are given equal weight, that the chances of them getting a legislation in their favor are roughly the same as anybody else's chances. So, because we know that this is something that we care about, and because we know that it might not happen if we just give people one person, one vote, you might want to deviate from this idea of simply equal voting power to ensure that sometimes people are given equal respect in representation and in the way legislations are made. I have only spoken so far from a theoretical perspective. And this is necessary because the kind of problems we are dealing with in delimitation are problems that run at the highest level of abstraction. Basically speaking, some of our intuitions regarding some of our automatic ways of thinking about voting aren't exactly precise in trying to understand what we want out of government. So, this is broadly how to think about this concept of one person, one vote. It isn't as neutral as we think about it. There are ways in which we have to add on to this concept of one person, one vote to arrive at something which is actually politically equal, where everybody gets equal consideration, that they are actually treated as having the same worth as an individual as anybody else. So just for the this Lok Sabha problem, there are a few solutions that are suggested. I won't go into these solutions in detail, um, but I'll just mention the last one, that if we really do care that in Parliament, different states, individuals are given equal worth, then maybe we will have to allocate these seats in a way that results in the population proportion being respected. And so southern Indian states and eastern Indian states might lose seats, the northern states will gain seats. What results from that is that every individual their vote is worth the same as any other individual's vote. And maybe what needs to be done is that the Rajya Sabha needs to be made more equal. The Rajya Sabha right now in Parliament is also divided up. The seats are allocated in a way that respects population size. How does this happen? The formula that was decided back in Constituent Assembly was that for every in a state, if the population has 5 million, then for those first 5 million, you will get one seat each. And for every additional 2 million population of that state. So if your state has a population of 5 million, and then you add on to every 2 seats, every 2 million to that 5 million. So it becomes 7 million, 9 million, 11 million. For every additional 2 seats, you get just one, sorry, additional 2 million, you get one seat. So a state which has 5 million population will get 5 seats. A state which has 7 million population will get 6 seats. A state which has 9 million population will get 7 seats, and so on. So it's a formula of one seat for the first 5 million and one additional seat for every additional 2 million. What is the meaning of this formula? This formula means that it is mostly population proportionate, the way in which seats are allocated in Rajya Sabha, but there is some additional weight given to smaller states and less weight given to larger states. So this means that there is population is given a little bit less weight than it is in the Lok Sabha, but it is still population proportionate. A solution to our problem could be make the Lok Sabha completely population proportionate, and in Rajya Sabha, make the seat allocation to different states either completely equal or more equal. You make it completely equal, then that will mean that the number of seats in the Rajya Sabha that go to Uttar Pradesh and to Sikkim will be the same, though Uttar Pradesh has a huge, much more population. There might be some things we want to add on to this solution. We might have to ensure that some of these big states get broken up. You have to divide Uttar Pradesh into 4 parts. Then each of those 4 parts will get one seat in the Rajya Sabha. Instead of Uttar Pradesh having only one seat, it will be divided into 4 states, and each of those 4 states will have one seat each. That might be something that will ensure that there isn't a very big political inequality in the Rajya Sabha, while ensuring that states as regions that have unique political and governance interests are not consistently ignored and not consistently neglected, such that there is predictable injustice. Because we are predicting this injustice, that the unique governance needs of particular regions are not ignored, we are deviating from one person, one vote to allow for this community as a group of people who have a different kind of interest to be adequately represented and to ensure that they have adequate power. I hope I've been able to explain the basic concepts of the values and principles that go behind this process called delimitation. It is a little complex. It deviates from many of our intuitions a little bit, but it's important to keep these in mind, that we are weighing and balancing between these two ideas of not knowing what people want and therefore giving them equal weight, and knowing that there might be injustice if we give them equal weight. And so deciding on the basis of both of these things. That's all I had to say to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Lalit. That was a very detailed, overview that we got on the principles of delimitation. There are a few questions. I will ask you if you want to take some of them, because some I don't know if will fall under your area of expertise, but if you have a opinion, you could share. But just for our audience, ಇದು ಸೆಷನ್ ಲಲಿತ್ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡ ಬರಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಲಾರ್ಜ್ಲಿ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷಲ್ಲೇ ಮೇಂಟೈನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಬಟ್ ಮುಂಬರೋ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಲೋಕಲ್ ಬಾಡಿ ಎಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಪರ್ಸ್ಪೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲೇ ಯಾರು ಒಬ್ರು ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪರ್ಟ್ನ ಕರ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಂದು ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಡಿಸ್ಕಷನ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ನಡೆಸ್ತೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಅದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಕ್ಷಮಿಸಿ, ಇದು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲೂ ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. But going back to some of the questions, Lalit, if you'd like to take some, because I'm not sure I think the last few ones, I think you can take it up. But I think Shivaraman sir has a lot more questions that seems a little out of scope, but if you have any thoughts, you could share with us.
Okay, I'll just go through some of them, which maybe I'm not so much aware about. Why have there been delays? I think this is a question that I'm not going through them, but I'm just mentioning that I do not know this because of my lack of study of the specific topic of Bangalore's elections and Bangalore's politics, or Mumbai's elections, Mumbai politics. Again, like I mentioned, we wanted to study this specific problem of what will happen to the Lok Sabha if we follow population proportionateness in a very rigid manner. And what will happen if we ignore this idea that populations are changing, on the other hand? But I hope that it can be kept in mind that if delimitation is ignored, if it
Right.
is not carried out, then if there are delays in delimitation, it can result in misalignment between population size and the number of representatives.
Of course, and now is the right time to get more public discourse around this idea, because political equality is what we'll all
And
strive for.
it's a great opportunity to really make Indian politics more fair, make it more
Yes,
wide based, have a wider base, and ensure that
better
more views are
represented,
reached.
maybe.
Yes.
Right.
So I think some of these are in the same line,
Mm.
more detailed than I might be able to answer.
Right.
Um, does
But
our existing
Santosh,
law,
yeah,
Santosh, yeah,
yeah.
does our existing law or constitutional provisions allow us to implement these concepts? So what I've discussed is, I think, a result of the fact that our existing constitutional principles do not account for this problem. That if we had a particular balance or weightage of power between different states at the time that the constitution was made, that
Mm.
some states have a particular amount of power. Let's say you started out with 10% of power at the start, and your population fell, or your population in proportion started to become less. By 20, 30, 50, 75 years, you might, instead of having 10% of power, you might have only 2% of power and influence over national politics. I do not think that the full implications of this problem, that population will completely decide your level of influence at the national level, was adequately considered at the time that the Constitution was made. So, this is actually not something that the Constitution currently provides for. And even freezing delimitation is not an answer to this question. So, to put it simply, the idea that there are communities that need representation and not just individuals, this idea has been accepted in the Constitution only insofar as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes go, but no further in considering the question of states as units that need representation of a different sort. Uh, this is from an anonymous attendee. Can you explain the structure and function of delimitation committee at the union and state? Is there provision given to electorate to object to illogical delimitation of seats? As I understand right now, the committee is largely through the composition of such committees, commissions involve members from political parties, bureaucrats, and I believe some judicial members as well. This is not something I'm completely sure about, but it has a broad base, and it's supposed to be a neutral, politically neutral body. And the crucial point, though, is that the electorate is only given a chance in some occasions to make its views heard if there has been a consultative process that is on the delimitation commission. Uh, there is currently in Indian law no opportunity even to challenge delimitation decisions in court. Though there are some judgments which are saying that there is some room for this, it has not yet crystallized properly to decide these questions. Normally, courts are supposed to stay out of delimitation, but this is something that is evolving a little bit. Shiva Mansar has said that, in my opinion, Rajya Sabha should be totally abolished. It has done more harm than good to the larger public. This is a subject that actually is very interesting to think about. There are many different views about this concept. The idea, I think, though, that I would like to put forward to ensure that what I discussed across this entire talk isn't left out of the picture. It is that when you are having governance at the union level, of course, there is a division of certain subjects which are left to state and there are certain divisions that the central government has to handle, that parliament has to handle. But that doesn't mean that when we are deciding how central government activities are carried out, all that matters is individuals. Sometimes groups also matter. And I will repeat this, that there is reservation in our constitutions for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It was not something that people thought that a scheduled caste person is just an individual like any other caste person. They realized that the group of scheduled caste is something that requires representation in a special way. Groups matter in that sense. And so, even in parliament, they have allowed for that group to have additional representation. Similarly, if, and this is a thing that you can think about and have a different view on, if you think that a state in India like Karnataka or Uttar Pradesh or Odisha or Rajasthan, if you think that a state is a community that deserves representation of a particular sort, then you will be able to arrive at the understanding that even in parliament, the Rajya Sabha as a body which represents states is something of value. Sampath says that population-based voting weightage might politically motivate to drop the population control programs in states. Okay, so yes, this is yeah, so this is an interesting thing. This is exactly what was discussed in 1970s, that if we give seats according to population size, then this will result in punishing states which have done better at population and making it and rewarding states that have not done population control. I think one thing to understand here is that yes, this is definitely an important consideration, but it is not the only consideration. One thing to keep in mind is that um, there are many ways in which to incentivize population control. Political power is one of them. And if we do not consider population at all, then the result is that, or let me put it slightly differently. If we do treat if we do treat states differently because of the way they have handled population control, we run the risk of ignoring the fact that some states don't actually have control over that population control program. They can't have full control over it, even if they try their hardest. So population might change even if you're doing much more about population control than another state is doing. You're trying, but at the end of the day, individuals have the right to have children. If they decide to have children, procreation is a right of bodily privacy. That if I decide to have a child, the government can't stop me from having it. That's a scheme that China has done, but we've not had it yet. Because we believe that there is a right to privacy over this idea of procreation, of having children. And if that's the case, and if a government can't control population, then punishing them for failing to control population is punishing the people of that state for something that they should not be punished for, something that they deserve to have the right to choose about. That's the other side of the same problem. Population control is important as a systemic thing, but as individuals, they should have the choice, and states may not be able to become responsible for these outcomes. Is there any bracket for the size of a constituency? Bracket for the size of a constituency, there is no ceiling on it right now. There is no floor on it either. Uh, the only requirement is that they should be of the same size inside any one state. The population should be the same. So if you see the map of constituencies of India, you will find that the less populous states, Assam or Arunachal Pradesh, have very big constituencies in geographical size. Because the population is less, the size of the constituency geographically is much bigger. But I think you mean population size here and not geographical size. For population size, one thing that started out is that in the Lok Sabha, when they first allocated seats, they decided that they will try to stick to this formula of one seat for 750,000 Indians. That was the formula in the initial stage. That has completely changed now because population sizes have completely changed across different states. But that only gives you an understanding about how things started out. In your view, is the election commission aware of these issues? So one also, have we tried to solve these issues or problems in the past? Just curious. So on the first question, is the election commission aware of these issues? What needs to be mentioned upfront is that the election commission in our scheme under law, it is not the body that is responsible for this question of delimitation. Instead, for national delimitation, for Lok Sabha delimitation, the delimitation is done by delimitation commissions made by a law of parliament. So this has happened three times in the past, and the fourth time it was not carried forward in terms of seat allocation, but inside states the constituency boundaries were drawn in 2000, early 2000s. So election commission, no, it doesn't need to know about this. It's instead these delimitation commissions. We have not seen delimitation commissions for Lok Sabha elections in some time. That's why we've forgotten about them, but they are supposed to be there. Have we tried to solve these issues? The specific issue that we have been discussing today, which was that how political equality might conflict with federal arrangements. This issue, they attempted to solve it. Indira Gandhi's government attempted to solve it in the 1970s. Their solution was what? Let's postpone delimitation. And what people think now is that if we keep postponing elections, it actually makes this problem more and more difficult. Leave it for 20 more years, and then the drastic change that will happen when you try to make it population proportionate will be even more drastic. So we have not properly tried to solve this issue. It is an upcoming issue that we have to solve. Anonymous attendee, distribution of population in terms of those who are affluent versus poorer sections are often influenced by how capital investment is concentrated, distributed in a city. When boundaries get drawn, how do we address this type of socio-economic inequality? This can happen even respective equality to educational levels. How can we ensure equality in such cases? So this is, like I mentioned, this concept of dividing different groups in such a way that they become minorities in different constituencies. This process can happen for any kind of group. It can happen to the supporters of a political party. You can divide Congress supporters into two different, or BJP supporters into two different constituencies so that they become minorities in both of those constituencies instead of being majority in one constituency. It can happen to supporters of a political party. It can happen to a caste group. It can happen to a religious group. It can happen to an income group. It can happen to an educational awareness literacy group as well. So this kind of process of divide and rule or gerrymandering can happen to any kind of group. At this stage, I can't tell you what is happening in particular areas. But what I can tell you is that for a delimitation commission to do this kind of thing in a biased way, or even by result, uh, it could happen that they don't intend to do it, and it happens by result. Even then, it is still a problem because the result is that, let's say, illiterate people, persons who do not have education of a particular level, they may become underrepresented. And keeping track of all of these different groups and criterias is an important part of ensuring that the delimitation process results in fair representation. So it's not as if any of these groups is outside of this consideration of how you should draw how you should do delimitation. It's just that some become more prominent because they are groups that are surveyed often, and we know where their geographical locations are. Santosh mentions, do you know of any democracy which implements all of these or more of these concepts? I don't know which concepts you're talking about here. I mean, many of these concepts are choices. So I'll just use the example of the US to give you an example of the solutions that I talked about in the last slide. The US Senate, which is like India's Rajya Sabha, they have equal representation of all states. The result is that even though California has so much more population than Wyoming, they are both having the same amount of representation at the national level in the US Senate. This is the Senate, which is representing the states, as opposed to the House of Representatives in the US Congress, which is representing individuals in constituencies across United States. So this is an example of how these concepts are being implemented. While there is complete political equality, and courts in the US also try to ensure that there is complete political equality, in the House of Representatives, there is a huge amount of political inequality. If you think about political inequality, equality in terms of one person, one vote. If you think about it that way, there is a huge amount of political inequality in the Senate. But they don't think of this as actually resulting in lower status to the people of California. The understanding is that states as communities deserve representation of an equal level in the US Senate because their interests matter. And because if we do not give them that representation, their interests will end up being neglected in the national level. So that I think might be a good example. I think that covers the questions that we've been asked.
I think that covers all the questions that has been, asked by our attendees. Thank you so much, Lalit, for joining with us today and sharing all the details. I am hoping that in the future we can collaborate again. And thank you all for all the attendees for staying with us, on a Monday evening. But we look forward to bringing more such interesting sessions to you all. And that note, I will end today, and thank you again to you and your team at Vidhi Legal.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ashita. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.